Who's going to pay for the wall? 100%.
But it's not Mexico, it's you and your tax dollars, and specifically your tax dollars that your elected representatives had allocated to the U.S. military. $3.6 billion are being taken from military construction projects to pay for the border wall that the president cannot get Congress to fund. Nearly $400 million of that diverted from projects in Puerto Rico, still suffering from past hurricanes Maria and Irma. Another $17 million from Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, after President Trump promised back in May he would help service members repair previous hurricane damage there. $13 million no longer going to a daycare at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland, and goes on and on. In total, 127 military-related projects on hold for now so the wall can be built. I want to bring in retired General and former Secretary of Defense James Mattis. He's out with his brand new book, Call Sign Chaos, Learning to Lead. I want to get to your book in a second, Mr. Secretary, but first, does it bother you to see U.S. service members deprived of these various projects, including child care facilities, ones approved by Congress in what is essentially an end run around the logical and established appropriations process?
Well, it's a concern, certainly, and I think what we see right now is the inability of the executive branch and legislative branch to come to an agreement on what is the problem. And so no matter what solution is proffered, they don't agree on it because it's not the problem the other one sees. And one of the things I learned in leading is the first thing you better do is agree on what problem you're trying to solve, or you're probably going to have a bit of chaos come out of the process.
So let's turn to your book. In the book you write, if you haven't read hundreds of books, you are functionally illiterate. You're a well-known bookworm. You have, I think, more than 7,000 books in your library. You go on to say in your book, any commander who claims he is, quote, too busy to read is going to fill body bags with his troops as he learns the hard way. So, as I don't need to tell you, this is a town, Washington, D.C., full of politicians who do not read books, who do not read at all. So what would your message be to a politician who says, I don't have time to read, every time I read half a page, I get a phone call that there's some emergency? What would you say to that politician?
You've got to carve out time to take care of your own personal development. You have written about the outpost. You know how much effort, training, reading, rehearsing goes into these young lads, 19, 25 years old, that we put out there on the front lines. And you would expect no less from their leaders, that they read and they study. It's not that they don't make mistakes then, but if you're not doing that at the policy and strategic level, then you are shortchanging the nation and you're shortchanging those that you send in harm's way.
One of the messages from your book, and also that you've talked a lot about this week, is how tribal politics and just American society has become. How people don't even talk to each other anymore, how Democrats and Republicans can't even work together anymore. There are politicians out there who their goal is to not bring people together. Their goal often seems to be to divide people, whether it's based on race or whatever. What do you think of them?
There is no team anywhere. CNN couldn't run like that. The military couldn't run like that. A business couldn't run like that. It would be dysfunctional. It would fail. And our system was set up with three co-equal branches of government. And just to make it a little more difficult, we made a bicameral legislature. And they all have to work together in order to make this work. What we're doing right now is we constantly are dividing. Now, I understand when you have an election, it can be brutal. It can be pretty hard. I'm smart, you're dumb. I know what's right, you're all wrong. You divide and you try to get yourself elected. Okay, that's democracy. But when the election's over, you don't continue to divide. Then you have to govern. So elections takes division and governing takes unity. And we're not doing the governing part. We're simply going election, 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 divide, divide, divide. Democracy cannot work like that.
I know that you're reluctant to criticize the current president, but a lot of people point out that his campaign seems in a lot of ways aimed at dividing the country, especially on issues related to race.
Well, the problems of division in this country go back decades right now. Clearly they go back, it didn't start with one party or one person. And if we're going to correct this problem, which is what we should be focused on, the majority of Americans are going to have to roll up their sleeves and they're going to have to work together. You can't expect one person to ride in and correct this. We're going to have to work on it together. We're going to have to find common ground or make common ground. But the democracy of the people, for the people, by the people. You're not going to have that work if you're not willing to compromise.
You include your resignation letter to President Trump in the book, and in the letter you note that you think Russia wants to shape a world based on authoritarianism at the expense of the United States and U.S. interests and allies. Do you think Russia should be permitted back into the G7?
Well, that's in more the economic vein, and I won't comment on that, but we're going to have to deal with the Putin that is, not the Putin we wanted. I remember in the 1990s when Russian Marines and U.S. Marines trained together in North Carolina for peacekeeping operations. Those days are long past now. We're going to have to recognize they've mucked around in our elections, that they've invaded 2 countries and seized territory, and we're going to have to deal with this, and the only way to deal with it is with allies.
You compared your military duty, and I think you've also talked about your duty as Secretary of Defense as riding for the brand, as is referred to in the West, meaning I work for Yellowstone Ranch and I ride for the brand. You write, quote, "In the U.S. military, we ride for the brand. If a civilian leader tells me to fight rustlers, that's what I do. If he tells me to round up wild horses, I do that." What is your least favorite thing that you did riding for the brand as Secretary of Defense?
Well, the book's not about Secretary of Defense.
I know.
Jake, and what I don't want to do is put myself from the defense establishment any more into that political discussion than, for example, Secretary Carter, my predecessor under President Obama. He would not do it. He studiously avoided going into political issues. And there's a 200-plus year tradition here, 200-plus years where we keep the military out of political assessments. Probably the most difficult thing I did during those years was to write letters to Gold Star parents.
As Secretary of Defense?
As Secretary of Defense. I'd done it also as a general. I'd done it as a colonel. I'd done it as a lieutenant colonel. I know the gravity of this. I probably can only sense the degree of tragedy to that family. You have to live through it in order to understand it. But the toughest thing, matter of fact, I put on my desk for whenever I signed those deployment orders a question that I would ask myself. I actually hand wrote the question out and scotch taped it to my desk, where twice a week or more often I would be signing them. And the question I asked myself each time: will this commitment contribute sufficiently to the well-being of the American people to justify putting our troops in a position to die? Not in harm's way, not to be injured, to die. And I hope that every time I answered that question, yes, and sent the troops overseas, that I was doing so with an understanding of what the Gold Star families have been through.
Secretary Mattis, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Congratulations again on the book.
Thank you, Jake.